Frank Sobotka is one of the most tragic characters in The Wire, because he is a man who keeps telling himself that he is crossing lines for the right reasons, and for a long time, part of that is actually true. He is not like Avon, who understands power as power. He is not like Stringer, who wants to turn crime into business. Frank belongs to a different world. He comes out of the docks, out of a union culture, out of a working life built on loyalty, routine, inheritance, and the belief that a man is supposed to leave something solid behind. He believes in work. He believes in names. He believes in the idea that men who break their backs on the waterfront should still matter. That is where his moral code begins. It begins in a place that sounds respectable, even noble. The problem is that by the time we meet him, that code has already started to rot from the inside, because the world it was built for is disappearing, and Frank cannot accept that without dragging everyone around him into the fall. That is what makes him such a strong character. Frank is not a hypocrite in the lazy sense. He does not preach goodness while secretly chasing pleasure. He is not Tony Soprano living two different lives at once and enjoying the contradiction. Frank really does believe in something bigger than himself. The Union is not a cover story for him. It is the center of his identity. When he talks about the docks, the grain pier, the canal, the jobs that used to exist, the political neglect of the port, he is not acting. He means it. He sees the waterfront as a dying body, and he sees himself as one of the last people trying to keep it breathing. That gives his criminal behavior a different texture from most other lawbreakers in the show. He is not driven by thrill, appetite, or vanity in the usual way. He is driven by panic. Panic at decline. Panic at irrelevance. Panic at becoming the last man standing at the funeral of a whole way of life. That panic becomes the engine of his moral collapse. Frank's code tells him that his first duty is not to the law, and not even to some universal idea of right and wrong. His first duty is to his people, to the men on the docks, to the Union, to the family name, to the men whose future is shrinking by the day while politicians smile, make promises, and forget them. In Frank's mind, this changes the meaning of corruption. He does not experience what he is doing as ordinary greed. He experiences it as adaptation. He is getting dirty in order to keep something clean alive. That is the lie he tells himself, and the reason it is such a powerful lie is because it has real emotion inside it. Frank is not pretending to care. He cares too much. That is why he is willing to justify almost anything. This is what makes his moral code both real and broken. It is real because it has structure. Frank is not completely loose. He has lines, or at least he thinks he does. He is not comfortable with random cruelty. He is not indifferent to death. He is not somebody who enjoys dealing with monsters. When the dead women in the container become part of the story, you can feel that this is not the business he thought he was in, or at least not the part of it he wanted to look at. Frank wanted to move cargo, grease palms, move money, make arrangements, and keep the Union alive long enough for political pressure to work. What he did not want was to stare directly at the human cost sitting inside the machinery he had joined, but that discomfort does not excuse him. It only reveals the selective nature of his conscience. Frank wants the benefits of criminal partnership without admitting what that partnership actually contains. He wants the smuggling without the bodies, the money without the trafficking, the deal without the blood. That is not morality. That is compartmentalization. And yet The Wire is careful with him because it understands that compartmentalization is not the same thing as evil in its pure form. Frank is guilty, but he is not hollow. He is compromised, but not empty. The show gives him one of its most painful contradictions. He is a man trying to protect a community by poisoning it. Every favor he does for the Union through illegal means pushes it further into dependency and dishonor. Every shortcut he takes in the name of survival weakens the very code of labor dignity that he thinks he is defending. He talks like a union man, but he is financing that union through criminal channels. He wants the next generation to inherit the waterfront, but what he is really passing down is desperation, compromised connections, and a lesson that survival now requires, bending the knee to worse men. That matters most when you look at his family. Frank's moral code is always tied to inheritance. He is not just saving jobs in the abstract. He is trying to hold together a whole structure of belonging. The family name means something to him. The docks mean something to him. The old ethic that a man should work, provide, and stand by his own means, something to him. But if you look at what happens around him, his code is failing in the very places where it should be strongest. Ziggy is the clearest example. Frank loves his son, but he cannot reach him. He does not understand how badly Ziggy is unraveling, and part of the reason is that Frank is too absorbed in the bigger emergency. He is trying to rescue the institution and losing the child right in front of him. That is one of the deepest judgments the show makes on him. Frank thinks in systems, history, labor, politics, and legacy, but morality is also personal attention. It is also seeing the person in your own house who is drifting toward ruin. Frank's code is strong enough to make him fight City Hall, but not calm enough to make him truly see Ziggy. Nick gets a different version of Frank. With Nick, Frank can at least imagine continuity. Nick feels more legible to him, more grounded, more functional, more like the kind of younger man who could still carry a piece of the old world forward. But even there, Frank ends up teaching the wrong lesson. He brings Nick closer to schemes, closer to smuggling, closer to the logic that everything is negotiable if the cause sounds righteous enough. Frank may tell himself that he is burdening himself so the younger generation does not have to, but that is not really what happens. His choices create the environment that pulls them in. He does not simply fail to shield them, he normalizes the very corruption that will poison them too. This is why Frank's moral code is so tragic. It is built on loyalty, but loyalty without clear moral boundaries turns into tribalism. He believes in taking care of his own, but once that becomes the highest principle, everyone outside that circle becomes easier to ignore. The law becomes an annoyance. The dead women become a complication. The criminals become business partners. The politicians become tools to be bought. The whole moral world narrows until the only question left is whether something helps the docks or hurts them. That is too small a frame for a decent man to live inside. It turns every wrongdoing into a temporary sacrifice, every compromise into necessity, every warning sign into something that can be dealt with later. Frank also has a very old-fashioned masculine code, and The Wire quietly dissects that too. He is proud. He wants to be useful. He wants to be respected. He does not want to be the man who watched the port die on his shift. That pride is not cartoon arrogance. It comes from work identity. The union gave him a role, and that role gave him moral language. He is a provider, an advocate, a leader, a man other men can count on. But when the world changes and the old institutions no longer have the same force, Frank does not reinvent himself. He doubles down. He starts trying to force reality to honor a code that reality has already stopped rewarding. That stubbornness is admirable for a while. Then it becomes destructive. There is a fine line between integrity and refusal to accept facts, and Frank crosses it. He is so committed to preserving the old dignity of labor that he ends up destroying that dignity with criminal money. What makes this even sadder is that Frank is not entirely wrong about the larger system. The port has been abandoned. The jobs are drying up. The political class does respond to money and leverage more than moral argument. The working men under Frank really are being crushed by a larger economic shift that no speech can fix. He is not paranoid. He is not imagining decline. The world of the docks is actually being left behind. That is one of the reasons viewers feel so much sympathy for him. He is diagnosing a real wound. The problem is his solution. Once he decides that the system is dirty enough to justify his own dirt, he enters a contest he was never built to win. Men like the Greeks live in that world completely. They do not carry Frank's illusions. They do not confuse utility with loyalty. They do not pretend that relationships are sacred if profit or risk points in another direction. Frank is trying to bargain with predators while still thinking like a steward. That makes him vulnerable. And that vulnerability says a lot about who he really is. For all his corruption, Frank is not naturally criminal in spirit. He is too sentimental, too rooted, too attached to memory and place. He still believes relationships mean something. He still thinks his cause gives him moral standing. He still acts as if being useful creates some protection. But organized crime at the level he touches has no respect for sentimental code. It may use words like trust and friendship, but underneath that is calculation. Frank enters that world because he thinks he can control the contamination. He cannot. Once he becomes useful to it, he is already marked by it. Once he becomes risky to it, he is disposable. His end is therefore not just sad, it is morally revealing. Frank dies because he tried to live between two moral universes and could not survive either one. In the lawful world he is corrupt. In the criminal world he is soft, conflicted, and ultimately untrustworthy. In his own mind he is still fighting for the men on the docks. That gap between self-understanding and reality is the final shape of his tragedy. Frank does not think of himself as a villain, the show does not either, but it also does not let him hide inside good intentions. He is a man whose motives are better than his actions, but not good enough to redeem them. The church window storyline captures a lot of this. On one level, it can look like vanity, and there is vanity in it. Frank wants a mark left behind. He wants recognition. He wants proof that his name still stands for something. But it is not simple ego, it is legacy hunger. It is a man trying to freeze respect in stained glass because he can feel everything else slipping away. That is one of Frank's deepest needs. He needs the world to say that his life, his labor, and his class were not meaningless. He needs a monument because the living structure he belongs to is collapsing. So even in the moments where he seems small or pompous, there is pain underneath it. He wants dignity in a time that keeps humiliating him. That need for dignity is the best part of Frank and the most dangerous part of him. It makes him human. It also makes him easy to trap. Because once dignity becomes tied to saving the docks at any cost, compromise starts to feel honorable. He can tell himself that he is sacrificing his own cleanliness for a larger good. He can feel like a martyr while committing crimes. He can transform shame into duty. That is the seductive power of his moral code. It lets him keep seeing himself as a protector even while he is feeding a machine that destroys the vulnerable. There is also something almost ancient about Frank's tragedy. He is a patriarch without real power, a guardian of a crumbling house, a man whose authority still exists emotionally after it has already started disappearing materially. He tries to act like the old rules are still in force, but history has moved on. The union can no longer protect the men the way it once did. Honest labor can no longer support the same life. Political access requires corruption. The waterfront itself has become less a center of the city than a leftover edge of it. Frank stands in the middle of all that, trying to will the past into the present. That gives him grandeur, but it also gives him blindness. He is fighting structural decline with personal grit, and that is never going to be enough. Still, it would be wrong to reduce him to a fool who could not adapt. Frank understands more than people give him credit for. He knows the world is changing. He knows speeches are not enough. He knows respectable channels are not working. His failure is not ignorance, it is moral miscalculation. He thinks emergency justifies contamination. He thinks cause can redeem method. He thinks he can enter darkness temporarily and still remain essentially separate from it. That is the core error. Frank treats corruption like a tool he can put down later, but corruption changes the hand that uses it. And maybe that is the deepest point of Frank Sobotka as a character. His moral code is not fake, it is simply incomplete. It has loyalty, duty, memory, sacrifice, and pride. What it lacks is a firm limit on what can be done in the name of those things. Once there is no solid limit, every virtue in that code can turn poisonous. Loyalty becomes silence, duty becomes obsession, memory becomes refusal to change, sacrifice becomes self-justified ruin, pride becomes denial. Frank's tragedy is that he never stops believing he is saving something worth saving, even as his way of saving it helps destroy whatever moral value it once had. That is why he lingers in people's minds long after Season 2 ends. Frank is not just a corrupt union boss. He is one of The Wire's clearest examples of how decent impulses can collapse into terrible outcomes when they are forced through a broken system. He is a man whose heart is pointed at the right people, but whose hands are willing to do too much. He loves his world, but he cannot save it without betraying it. He has a code, but the code is built for loyalty, not for truth. And in The Wire, that is never enough. The world punishes sentiment without judgment. It punishes men who think good intentions can manage dirty alliances. Frank Sobotka is not evil. He is something sadder than that. He is a man with a real moral center that is too narrow, too compromised, and too desperate to hold under pressure. That is what destroys him. And that is what makes him one of the most human characters in the entire show.